Alright, what's going on, everyone? So if you haven't heard, it was recently announced that Standard is rotating differently. That is to say that sets are going to stay in Standard for 3 years instead of 2. Basically, Standard will be composed of 3 years worth of sets, and when it rotates, 1/3 of the format will change. Basically, the oldest year. It's still going to rotate every year, and it's still going to rotate 1 year's worth of sets out, but we're going to have 3 years of sets in Standard instead of 2, so the format will be bigger and rotations will be less dramatic. And the reason for this is apparently Standard is dead in Paper. No one's playing Standard in Paper. It's been rough, it's been bad, no one plays, and the question that Wizards of the Coast is asking, I believe they even asked it in the article, or if not, Aaron Forsyth tweeted about it, basically asking like, why don't you play Standard anymore? Why doesn't anyone play Standard anymore? Even like local game stores that are open, because a lot have closed, mine did a few years ago, even the ones that are open, people aren't playing Standard. They're playing Pioneer, they're playing Modern, and they're playing Commander, but not Standard. So why is that? And I don't have, obviously, the answer, because there probably isn't an exact answer, but my opinion, my experience is that I think, personally, that people are just getting burnt out on Standard as a result of Arena. Arena, I think it's great. It's, for some reason, very controversial. It is the most accessible way to play Tier 1 decks in any form of Magic. Like, if you want to play Tier 1 in Paper, it's hundreds of dollars. If you want to play Tier 1 on Magic Online, it's hundreds of dollars. But everyone can build a Tier 1 deck on Arena. I personally spend $50 per set, and with $50 per set, I have every Tier 1 deck in Standard and every Tier 1 deck in Pioneer or Explorer, and I still have piles of wild cards. So if I spent that much on Paper or Magic Online, like I wouldn't have a play set of like Shieldreds are like $50 each on Arena or on online on Magic Online the last time I checked. So, $200 for 4 copies of one card is not something that I want to pay personally. But the point is, it's accessible. People can play with Tier 1 decks, and that's good. The downside of that is, well, people are playing with Tier 1 decks every day, all week. And then who wants to do that and then go to Friday Night Magic and pay $5 plus hundreds of dollars for a deck to play with the same decks and against the same decks, right? It's just the same. It's the same thing. It's the same thing we're playing on Magic Arena. And you might be thinking, well, wasn't that true for Magic Online? And the answer is no, because with Magic Online, it has the same problems that Paper has, which is that it's pay to win. If you can pay for the expensive cards, then you're just more capable of winning games than people who can't. But the good news is, it's not a good thing, but the side effect of that is, well, lots of people can't afford to buy the expensive cards. So I used to record on Magic Online. This started out as a Magic Online channel way back 5 years ago, and back then, I couldn't afford to play Tier 1 decks. I only played budget jank, and I would play 5 games with every deck I showcased, and in those 5 games, I might play against Tier 1 decks like once or twice. Everyone played with jank because that's the only thing people could afford. And when you got matched up against a Tier 1 deck, it was like, whoop, that's a Tier 1 deck. I'll take my loss here, right? I'm going to lose against the Tier 1 deck. But in the other games, it was just jank versus jank. And that's just the nature of the pay-to-win, expense of Paper and Magic Online is, people can pay for Tier 1 decks and win against people who can't. But everyone who can't plays, random jank crap, and it's kind of fun. I guess that's kind of par for the course for this channel as well. Beat the janky budget brews fairly easily, and then get our butt kicked by the Tier 1 competitive decks. But hey, we're playing budget decks. That's kind of what happens.
What do you say?
I don't know.
But on Magic Arena, there's accessibility in terms of Tier 1 decks. Everyone can afford a Tier 1 deck, and so everyone's playing Tier 1 decks. And in fact, not only can everyone afford to play Tier 1 decks, but you're also kind of encouraged to play Tier 1 decks because spending wild cards on rares that aren't in Tier 1 decks feels pretty bad. You don't want to spend wild cards on a card that's just going to lose you games. And the client is very motivating. It motivates you to win games. You have to win games for your weekly wins. You have to win games for your daily wins. You have to win games to rank up. So it's like win, build Tier 1 decks and win. So it is a trade-off, right? You have Magic Online, which is fun, casual, jank, silly, cheap if you play jank, but really, really expensive if you don't. And then Magic Arena, accessible Tier 1, but also everyone plays Tier 1 decks. So in the, pre-arena days, you would play Magic Online, you'd play Standard on Magic Online, and you'd play with whatever random jank crap you had, and you'd play against people who had whatever random jank crap they had. But then you'd go to Friday Night Magic and, well, it was different piles of random jank, and, it was the same, right? It was, you played with whatever cards you had or whatever deck you could afford, and people who paid for tier 1 decks would just run you over, and that's just how it worked. But it felt different. If you would play with different decks, you'd be playing against different decks. Yes, the same tier 1 decks that kicked your butt on Magic Online would also kick your butt at Friday Night Magic, but at least you played a different deck. But now we're at a point where you're either playing the same decks, you're playing tier 1 decks on Arena, and you're playing tier 1 decks in paper, or you play a tier 1 deck on Magic Arena because everyone can afford a tier 1 deck on Magic Arena. But then you go to paper, you can't afford the $400 deck, so you build a casual jank deck, and then you get beat up by the tier 1 decks that you have on Arena, and that's kind of frustrating, right? It's frustrating when you can't afford a tier 1 deck in paper, but you have it on Arena, so you play with it on Arena, you feel the power, and then you go to Friday Night Magic and you're like, I'm just going to play with this budget deck. And those decks that you have on Arena, they just completely crush you. And it's like, well, it'd be nice if I could play with that deck, but it's too expensive, right? So I think Magic Arena is just leading to burnout, where it's like the same decks and the same decks and the same decks, which is interesting because the solution to this, apparently, according to Wizards of the Coast, is to not rotate Standard as much, meaning those tier 1 decks that beat you up so much on Arena are going to be legal for longer. That seems like the opposite problem. People have been saying, like, great, gonna be seeing Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Invoke Despair for even longer, and they're right. All those same decks that are burning you out of Standard are still gonna be in Standard for the next year. Seems like we should be doing the opposite of this, and we actually did. For those who don't know, Wizards of the Coast announced, when was it, a couple years ago, that Standard would rotate faster. Was it a couple years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago? Was it 5 years? How long ago was it? Anyway, there was a point where Wizards of the Coast wanted to rotate Standard faster, and people complained about it. And their complaints were valid, because Magic is very expensive. You don't want to spend, several $100s on Standard decks, and then, well, they're just gone, right? That's a problem. But now the burnout, here's the same Rakdos mid-range deck that I've been playing against all week on Arena, that's just going to be more dramatically emphasized. So I don't know if it fixes the problem, in my opinion, assuming that it is this burnout thing that I think it is, which is, I'm just sick of playing against Rakdos mid-range. I would love a fresh Standard. And how do people feel about not only playing against Rakdos mid-range all week on Arena, but then going in paper and then, well, there it is again, and you have to pay money to get beat by it. Yeah, that's fun. Or you have to spend several $100s on a deck to compete with it. Well, that's fun. Who wants to spend, $300 or $400 so they can compete with Rakdos mid-range in paper like they do on Arena every day? It's just not fun. So what's the solution? How do we fix this? And in my opinion, there is like really dramatic things we could do, like making winning less of an emphasis on Arena. Maybe don't make the Mastery Pass so strict, because you basically have to get all of your daily challenges and weekly wins to finish the Mastery Pass, so it forces you to play constantly, not constantly, like twice a week at least, but you do have to log in regularly and get those challenges completed, or you're not going to get your Mastery Pass done. You have to win, and maybe if there was a little bit more leniency in the Mastery Pass, so people didn't have to win every game they play and play a lot, then maybe people wouldn't feel so pressured to play Tier 1. That would be a great change. Or if that's if that's just too much, then maybe just not making Standard the standard format of Arena would be a huge improvement. I think Historic Brawl is a good example. I think Historic Brawl is a fantastic format on Arena because it gives people who like Commander something to play, but it doesn't take away from their experience playing Commander in paper, because it's different, right? It's different. If you love Commander, playing Historic Brawl on Arena isn't the same, and it's not going to detract from your enjoyment of the paper format. Whereas if you're a Standard player, if you're playing against Rakdos mid-range all week, you're not going to want to go pay $5 to enter a paper tournament to play against the same deck. So maybe if Standard wasn't the key format on Arena, maybe if there was more formats like, like Artisan, Pauper, stuff like that, maybe that would help. I know there's Alchemy, but Alchemy's so expensive and so inaccessible, I would say. It's just It's not good. Not good in my opinion. I know some people like it. I'm not saying the format is bad. I'm saying that it's not a good replacement for standard, but there needs to be a really good format that becomes like the staple format that people go to Arena for, that maybe isn't directly connected to paper, which is weird because I have been saying that there is nothing more important right now than getting Pioneer on Arena and, merging those formats, because having Explorer and Pioneer is kind of weird. Would like to see them just more unified so there's a bit more consistency, because, Pioneer players aren't watching Explorer content and Explorer players aren't watching Pioneer content, and you're dividing the community a bit there, and it would be nice just to get them together. But the flip side of that same coin is, well, the burnout of playing against the same decks in both Arena and paper, and finding a way to make that less prevalent would probably help a lot. So that's my theory. Is it accurate? Is it correct? I don't know. I'm just kind of rambling here. You guys will have to let me know if you play paper standard and Magic Arena standard. Does this seem accurate to you? If you have stopped playing standard, was it because you were burnt out on the format? Am I onto something here, or am I just completely off base? But that's my theory. Is it burnout? The answer is maybe. I don't know. But we'll see if this change fixes anything. We'll see if 3 years of the same decks fixes everything, or if it just makes it worse. Will people be more confident spending money on standard knowing that the decks will last longer, or are they just gonna be more burnt out than before? I guess we'll only find out as time goes by, but in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.